Chapter 130 The Hat. And now that the proper time and place, after so long and wide a preliminary cruise, Ahab, all other whale waters swept, seeming to have chased his foe into an ocean fold to slay him the more securely there, now that he found himself hard by the very latitude and longitude where his tormenting wound had been inflicted, now that a vessel had been spoken which on the very day preceding it actually encountered Moby Dick, and now how that his successful meetings with various ships contrastingly concurred to show the demanding influence with which the white whale tore his hunters, whether sinning or sinned against. Now it was there that lurked something in the old man's eye, which it was hardly sufferable for feeble souls to see, as the unsettling polar star which through the lifelong Arctic 6 months night sustains its piercing steady central gaze, so Ahab's purpose now fixedly gloomed down upon the constant midnight of the gloomy crew. It was domineering above them so that their bodings, doubts, misgivings, fear were fain to hide beneath their souls, and not sprout forth a single spear or leaf. In this foreshadowing interval, too, all humor forced or natural vanished. Stubb no more strove to raise a smile, Starbuck no more strove to check one. Alike joy and sorrow, hope and fear seemed ground to finest dust and powdered for a time in the clamped mortar of Ahab's iron soul. Like machines, they dumbly moved about the deck, ever conscious that the old man's despot eye was upon them. But did you deeply scan him in his more secret, confidential hours when he thought no glance but one was upon him? Then you would have seen that Ahab's eyes so awed the crews, the inscrutable Parsi's glance awed his, or somehow, at least in some wild way at times affecting it. Such an added, gliding strangeness began to invest the thin Fedallah now. Such ceaseless shuddering shook him that the men looked dubious at him, half uncertain as it seemed whether indeed he were a mortal substance, or else a tremulous shadow cast upon the deck by some unseen being's body. And that shadow was always hovering there. For not by night even had Fedallah ever certainly been known to slumber or go below. He would stand still for hours, but never sat or leaned. His wan but wondrous eyes did plainly say, "We two watchmen never rest." Nor at any time by night or day could the mariners now step upon the deck unless Ahab was before them, either standing in his pivot hole or exactly pacing the planks between two undeviating limits, the main mast and the mizzen, or else they saw him standing in the cabin scuttle, his living foot advanced upon the deck as if to step, his hat slouched heavily over his eyes, so that however motionless he stood, however the days and nights were added on, that he yet swung his hammock, yet hidden beneath that slouching hat they could never tell unerringly whether, for all this, his eyes were really closed at times, or whether he was still intently scanning them. No matter, though he stood in the scuttle for a whole hour on stretch, and the unheated night damp gathered in the beads of dew upon that stone-carved coat and hat, the clothes that the night had wet, the next day's sunshine dried upon him, and so, day after day, night after night, he went no more beneath the planks. Whatever he wanted from the cabin things he sent for. He ate in the same open air, that is, his two only meals, breakfast and dinner. Supper he never touched, nor reaped his beard, which darkly grew all gnarled as unearthed roots of trees blown over, which still grow idly on the naked base, though perished in the upper verdure. But though his whole life was now become one watch on deck, and though the Parsi's mystic watch was without intermission as his own, yet these two never seemed to speak one man to the other, unless at long intervals some passing unmomentous matter made it necessary. Though such a potent spell seemed secretly to join the twain, openly and to the awestruck crew they all seemed pull like asunder. If by day they chanced to speak one word, by night dumb men were both, so far concerned the slightest verbal interchange. At times, for longest hours, without a single hail, they stood far parted in the starlight, Ahab in his scuttle, the Parsee by the mainmast, but still fixedly gazing upon each other, as if the Parsee Ahab saw his forthrown shadow, and Ahab the Parsee saw his abandoned substance. And yet somehow did Ahab in his own proper self, as daily, hourly, and every instant commandingly revealed to his subordinates, Ahab seemed an independent lord, the Parsee but his slave. Still again both seem yoked together, and an unseen tyrant driving them, the lean shade sliding the solid rib. For this the Parsee was what he may, all rib and keel was solid Ahab. The very first faintest glimmering of the dawn, his iron voice was heard from aft, "Man the mastheads!" And all through the day, till after sunset and after twilight, the same voice every hour at the striking of the helmsman's bell was heard, "What d'ye see? Sharp! Sharp!" But when 3 or 4 days had slided by after meeting the children seeking Rachel, and no spout had yet been seen, the monomaniac old man seemed distrustful of his crew's fidelity. At least of nearly all except the pagan harpooners. He seemed to doubt even whether Stubb and Flask might not willingly overlook the ship he sought. But if these suspicions were really his, he sagaciously refrained from verbally expressing them, however his actions might seem to hint them. "I will have the first sight of the whale myself," he said. "I, Ahab, must have the doubloon." And with his own hands he rigged a nest of basketed bowlines, and sending a hand aloft with a single sheaved block to secure the mainmast head, he received the two ends of the downward reeved rope, and attached one to his basket, prepared a pin for the other end, in order to fasten it at the rail. This done, and with that end yet he took his hand, and standing beside that pin, he looked round upon his crew, sweeping from one to the other, pausing his glance long upon Daggoo, Queequeg, and Tashtego, but shunning Fedallah, and then settling his firm relying eye upon the chief mate, said, "Take the rope, sir, I give it into thy hands, Starbuck." Then arranging his person in the basket, he gave word for them to hoist him to his perch, Starbuck being the one who secured the rope at last, and afterwards stood near it. And thus, with one hand clinging round the royal mast, Ahab gazed upon the sea for miles and miles, ahead, astern, this side and that, within the wide expanded circle commanded at so great a height. When working with his hands at some lofty, almost isolated place in the rigging, which chances to afford no foothold, the sailor at sea is hoisted up to that spot and sustained there by the rope. Under these circumstances, its fastened end on the deck is always given in strict charge to some one man who has the special watch of it, because in such a wilderness of running rigging, whose various different relations aloft cannot always be infallibly discerned by what is seen at them on deck, and when the deck ends of these ropes are being every few minutes cast down from the fastenings, it would be but a natural fatality if, unprovided with a constant watchman, the hoisted sailor should, by some carelessness of the crew, be cast adrift and fall, all swooping to the sea. So Ahab's proceedings in this matter were not unusual. The only strange thing about them seemed to be that Starbuck, almost the one only man who had ever ventured to oppose him with anything in the slightest degree approaching to decision, or one of those two whose faithfulness on the lookout he had seemed to doubt somewhat. It was strange that this was the very man he should select for the watchman, of freely giving his whole life into such an otherwise distrusted person's hands. Now, the first time Ahab was perched aloft, ere he had been there 10 minutes, one of those red-billed savage seahawks which so often fly incommodiously close round the manned mastheads of the whalemen in these latitudes, one of these birds came wheeling and screaming round his head in a maze of untrackably swift circlings. Then it darted 1,000 feet straight up into the air and spiralized downward and went eddying again around his head. But with his gaze fixed upon the dim and distant horizon, Ahab seemed not to mark this wild bird, nor indeed would anyone else have marked it much, it being no uncommon circumstance. Only now, almost the least heedful eye seemed to see some sort of cunning meaning in almost every sight. Your hat, sir," suddenly cried the Sicilian seaman, who, being posted at the mizzen masthead, stood directly behind Ahab, though somewhat lower than his level, and without a deep gulf of air dividing him. But already the sable wing was before the old man's eyes, and the long hooked bill was at his head. With a scream, the black hawk darted away with his prize. An eagle thrice round Tarquin's head, removing his cap to replace it, and thereupon Tanaquil, his wife, declared that Tarquin would be king of Rome. But only by the replacing of the cap was that omen accounted good. Ahab's hat was never restored. The wild hawk flew on and on with it, far in advance of the prow, and at last disappeared, while from the point of that disappearance a minute black spot was dimly discerned, falling from the vast height into the sea. This is the end of chapter 30. So Ahab decided to stand watch. Now we have a few days where Ahab and Fedallah are on the boat, both always on deck, staring around, on watch, and they're described as Fedallah is described as being a shadow and not entirely of substance, which kind of he's like not there, he's ghost-like. And that kind of goes along with the him being a mystic. And it's also, he's described as being the shadow of Ahab, and Ahab being his form. So once again, we have another person who on the ship is trying, or is perceived as being part of Ahab, or the two of them being a whole person, because Ahab in this instance is not a whole person. He's missing the leg, that's one thing. But at the other time, he doesn't have he's so focused on the whale, he's lost so much of his humanity. So it's not like he's an actual real person, he's more like a machine. It talks about how this fades onto the crew, where Starbuck is no longer being overly intentionally stern, and Stubb is not being overly and intentionally happy. Just the two of them are being, and they are walking around just doing things. And Ahab is described as being a statue at one point, where it's like his clothing is made out of stone, and the dew forms on him because he's made out of stone, and then the sun dries it because he is still in the same position. And Fedallah is likewise still in the same position. He doesn't sit, he doesn't lean, he just stands and looks. And then after a few days of this, Ahab is like, you guys are slackers, you're not seeing my whale for me, send me up to the top. So he rigs a seat and has a rope set up, and he gets hoisted up to the top to look around, so that he is standing whale watch, which is unprecedented. And he has someone hold the rope, which secures him. Now, they say that this is a normal practice, and it really is a good practice, because big ship, lots of ropes, lots of sails. Okay, you want to turn the sail a little bit this way. Well, you have ropes that secure it, so you take the rope and you pull it down, and you tie it around a post, and you hold it steady so that the sail is turned a little bit, which gives you much more steering than just the simple rudder at the back. So you can, tilt the sails a little bit, or you can tilt them different ways. And you also need to hold them steady and raising and lowering various pieces of sail. So there's a rope to the bottom of the sail, goes up over the top. And so you pull it up and you have less sail. And a reason for wanting less sail is to control the speed so you don't go too fast. Or if the wind is blowing too hard, then you run the risk of breaking the mast, breaking the sail. So you pull up the sails a little bit, and you pull up the sails a little bit, you can get a more constant speed and don't risk wrecking the boat. So you have all of these ropes, and you can't always see where they go. So they say that the standard practice is when someone's aloft, you always have one person whose job it is to watch that one rope that holds and saves their lives. And this is an incredibly important safety thing because, if you're having all of these ropes constantly being hooked and unhooked, it's so easy to grab the wrong rope. It's like, oh yeah, I tied off this rope to the mainmast sail. It's like, oops, no, that was the captain. That's why they always had someone watching a rope when they had someone aloft, because, it could be viewed as murder. Now, Ahab picked the one person who everybody thought would murder him. And, Starbuck actually contemplated murder there for a while. He was standing there with the rifle pointed at the captain's head through the door. He's like, I can end this now. I can go home. I can see my wife and my little boy. All I have to do is man up, pull the trigger, and kill Ahab. So Ahab probably didn't know that Starbuck was going to shoot him. But Ahab knew that he threatened to shoot Starbuck. So the two of them, they don't get along. This is probably going to be the last time the two of them go out together on the same ship. Because, it's like, this isn't going to work out. And there's lots of ships that sail out of Nantucket, so it's going to be easy enough for Ahab to get a new first mate. Or it's going to be easy enough for Starbuck to say, hey, I served as first mate on the Pequod, all of these successful voyages, give me my own ship. Or I'll be first mate on, the Rachel or the Town Ho or whichever ship is happening to be heading out when they get back. So they always have someone picking, and Ahab picked the one person he could probably trust the least. At the same time, this is the person who he can trust the most, because he is not going to let it be an accident. Because everyone knows that there's bad blood between the two of them. So everybody knows that if an accident happens, it may not have been an accident. So while Starbuck is the one most likely to intentionally kill him, he is the one least likely to accidentally kill him. And at this point, Ahab is figuring an accident is far more likely than murder. So he's like, Starbuck, watch the rope. So that is that. Be careful with rigging.